The morning sun stretched long shadows across the courtyard of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou as the encrypted message arrived. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat at his desk, reviewing agricultural reports, his mind fixed on the coming harvest season, a season that would determine the food security of his people. The aide who entered moved with unusual hesitation, clutching a tablet as if it burned in his hands. The silence in the room grew heavy when Ibrahim noticed the troubled expression on his face. "What is it, Mamadou?" he asked, setting his pen down with deliberate calm. The weight of unspoken words hung thick in the air, like the dust that precedes the harmattan winds. Mamadou's voice cracked as he read the message transmitted through diplomatic channels from Washington. "Mr. President, there's been a demand from the American administration." The words tasted bitter, each syllable dripping with the arrogance of colonial memory. Trump's message was direct, yet deeply insulting. Ibrahim was expected to present himself for a ceremonial salute at an upcoming international summit. The language carried not the tone of one sovereign addressing another, but of a master commanding a subordinate. Ibrahim's jaw tightened as the insult settled in. His fingers tapped against the mahogany desk, crafted decades ago by his grandfather, who had lived and died fighting for dignity. A profound silence filled the room, echoing with the voices of ancestors who had resisted foreign domination. Slowly, Ibrahim rose. His military bearing evident in every step, he walked to the window that overlooked the vibrant streets of his capital. Below, vendors called out their wares in Moor and Diala. Children darted between market stalls, their laughter carried on the air. Life pulsed with the rhythm that had sustained his people for centuries. These were the lives he had sworn to protect, not just from bullets and bombs, but from the subtle chains of disrespect and domination. The irony was sharp. The man who had seized power to restore dignity was now being asked to surrender it. His reflection in the window showed the face of a leader who had already made his choice. "Mamadou, prepare a response," he said, his voice steady with the weight of unshakable resolve. "But first, convene the Council of Elders. They must hear this." Some insults, he knew, required the wisdom of generations to answer. As Mamadou hurried out, Ibrahim remained at the window, watching his people live freely on their own soil. Soon the afternoon call to prayer would echo across the city, a reminder that some forms of submission were sacred, while others could never be accepted. He walked down the corridors of the palace, walls lined with portraits of Burkina Faso's heroes. Each face told a story of resistance and dignity. Thomas Sankara's piercing gaze seemed to follow him, a reminder of the price paid for true independence. The revolutionary's words echoed in his mind. "He who feeds you controls you." How many African leaders had forgotten this simple truth, trading sovereignty for foreign approval? The weight of expectation pressed down on his shoulders as he entered his private study. Every step carried the hopes of a continent that had too often watched its sons bow to Western arrogance. Leather-bound books filled the shelves, chronicling centuries of struggle against domination and erasure. His hand brushed the spine of a biography on Traoré Traoré, the warrior who had resisted French colonization until his dying breath. Those men had faced cannons and rifles. He faced something more insidious, the expectation of voluntary submission. The air in the study felt dense with the spirits of ancestors who had chosen death over kneeling. Ibrahim pulled out a worn copy of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, its yellowed pages marked with his notes. Fanon's words on the psychological violence of colonialism felt sharper, more urgent than ever. A knock interrupted his thoughts. His chief of staff entered with a folder marked Continental Relations. Inside were documents that chilled him. The same demand had been made to other African leaders. Some had complied quietly, their submissive photographs paraded in Western media as proof of successful diplomacy. Others had dodged the humiliation with carefully crafted maneuvers. The images told the story of a continent still struggling to rise tall. Each photograph was another wound carved into Africa's collective dignity. Ibrahim closed the folder and walked to the wall where his grandfather's ceremonial sword hung between two Burkinabe flags. His hand rested on the hilt. The old man had fought the French with this very blade, dying before independence came, but dying with honor unbroken. "What would you do, grandpère?" Ibrahim whispered into the quiet room. The metal felt warm beneath his palm, as though carrying the fire of generations who refused to bow. Outside, the ancient drums began to beat, summoning the community together as they had for centuries. The answer came not in words, but in that steady rhythm, the heartbeat of a people who had weathered every storm. The palace of Kosiam stood like a fortress of African pride, unyielding against the crimson sky of dusk. Its modern architecture blended seamlessly with traditional mossy design, creating a structure that embodied both heritage and progress. The red clay walls seemed to beat with the pulse of the nation, while the geometric patterns carved into the entrance told stories older than written history. Security guards in crisp uniforms moved with quiet efficiency, their eyes sharp, their expressions calm. This building had witnessed the birth of a new Burkina Faso, and tonight it would bear witness to another defining moment. As Ibrahim approached his office, the weight of the structure seemed to mirror the gravity of his decision. Inside the presidential chamber, the hum of the air conditioning softened the heat rising from the streets of the capital. The room was sparse yet dignified, furnished with locally crafted pieces that spoke of authenticity rather than ostentation. A vast map of Africa dominated one wall, its bold borders a reminder of the continent's true scope and untapped potential. On his desk, carved from a single piece of local wood, lay the scars of countless decisions made before this night. Through bulletproof windows, the lights of Ouagadougou twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a life, a dream, a future. This was the nerve center of a nation that had chosen dignity over convenience. The evening call to prayer drifted through the windows, mingling with the sounds of traffic and distant laughter below. Children's voices echoed from nearby neighborhoods, speaking in languages that had survived centuries of attempted erasure. The scent of wood smoke and spices rose from cooking fires, carrying with it the essence of a culture that refused to be broken. Ibrahim stood at his window, watching vendors pack away their stalls as workers returned home. These were his people, living their lives in a freedom previous generations had died to secure. The palace was not merely a building. It was a living symbol of their collective refusal to be diminished. An aide entered quietly, carrying a tray of traditional tea. He set it gently on the low table where Ibrahim often held informal meetings. The young man's movements were respectful but not servile, embodying the balance between hierarchy and dignity that defined the new Burkina Faso. "The elders are gathering in the council chamber, Mr. President," he said, his voice steady despite the tension that hung in the air. Ibrahim nodded, pausing to savor the ritual of tea. The bubbling liquid mirrored the determination brewing within the palace walls. As the steam curled upward, he knew that whatever decision came from tonight's gathering would be born from the wisdom of generations. The council chamber filled with the rustle of robes as the elders assembled around the ancient wooden table. Madou Ouedraogo, the eldest among them, moved slowly but with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen independence and endured every trial since. His hands, weathered by decades of farming and craftsmanship, rested firmly on a walking stick carved from baobab wood. The others, teachers, chiefs, former freedom fighters, keepers of oral tradition, took their places in accordance with custom. Their lined faces carried the weight of wisdom earned through hardship, resilience, and devotion to their people. The air thickened with the gravity of the moment. Ibrahim entered and greeted each elder with gestures of respect, his modern military discipline blending seamlessly with ancient traditions. "Grandfathers," he began, using the word that acknowledged them as guardians of memory and wisdom. We face a test that echoes the trials of our ancestors, though it takes a form they never encountered. The room grew still as he recounted the American president's demand. Each word was chosen carefully, conveying both the arrogance of the request and the insult it carried. The elders listened in silence, their faces shifting from disbelief to anger, and finally to calm, resolute understanding. When Ibrahim finished, the silence stretched, broken only by the night breeze carrying the scent of shea butter and millet from the neighborhoods outside. Old Madhu spoke first, his voice strong with the authority of experience. In my youth, we were forced to remove our hats before French administrators, to bow our heads and accept their superiority. His eyes burned with remembered humiliation. We swore that our children would never endure such shame. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the council. Their glances spoke volumes, of humiliation endured, of lessons remembered, of resolve hardened. "This is not politics," declared Fatimata Kabor, the only woman among them, her voice sharp as steel. "This is about whether we teach our grandchildren to stand tall, or to crawl." The chamber seemed to vibrate with the force of their unity. The discussion that followed was measured, never hurried. Each elder contributed in turn, drawing upon traditional stories, personal memories, and the depth of cultural wisdom. They spoke of Yaninga, the warrior princess who had founded their kingdom, and of countless unnamed heroes who had chosen death over submission. As the moon rose above Ouagadougou, casting silver light across the chamber's windows, the council reached its decision. Unanimous. Ibrahim listened as Mamadou delivered their verdict with the solemnity of a sacred rite. "A man who kneels by choice can rise again, but a people who bow on command may never rise." The decision was sealed, not by decree, but by the collective wisdom of those who had carried the nation's soul through its darkest times. The news spread across Ouagadougou like wildfire. Motorcycle taxis roared through intersections, their drivers shouting updates. In the bustling Grand Marché, vendors left their haggling to cluster around crackling radios that repeated reports of the American president's demand. Aminata Sawadogo, a cloth seller with calloused hands and eyes that burned with pride, slammed her fist onto her wooden counter. "Who does he think he is, ordering our president around like a colonial governor?" she declared to the crowd gathering around her stall. The other traders nodded vigorously, their voices rising in a chorus of indignation that echoed through the covered market. By noon, the entire city seemed to pulse with a collective anger that had been building for generations. Outside the university, students gathered in spontaneous groups, their conversations animated by the same fire that had driven their predecessors to demand independence. Borma Traore, a philosophy student with dreams of becoming a teacher, stood on the steps addressing his classmates. "This is exactly what Sankara warned us about, the subtle chains that replace the obvious ones," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. The young people around him represented the future of Africa, educated and proud, unwilling to accept the diminished expectations of previous generations. Their smartphones buzzed with messages from friends across the continent, all sharing the same sentiment of wounded dignity. The afternoon sun beat down on their determined faces as they planned their response to this latest insult. In the working-class neighborhoods, mechanics and construction workers gathered during their lunch break to discuss the implications of the American demand. Isaac Kabor, a master carpenter whose hands had built homes throughout the capital, spoke with the authority of someone who had watched his country transform. "My father built schools so we could read, not so we could bow to foreign masters," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. The men around him, taxi drivers, shopkeepers, laborers, represented the backbone of the nation, and their anger was palpable. They had chosen Ibrahim as their leader precisely because he promised to restore their dignity on the world stage. The very thought of their president saluting a foreign leader made their blood boil with righteous fury. As evening approached, The city's mood had crystallized into something powerful and unmistakable. From the wealthy neighborhoods of Ouaga 2000 to the bustling streets of Sison, the message was clear. Burkina Faso would not be humiliated. Social media exploded with hashtags and memes mocking the American president's arrogance, while traditional drummers began gathering in the city squares. The sound of talking drums carried messages of solidarity from compound to compound, neighborhood to neighborhood. By sunset, it was clear that Ibrahim's decision would not be his alone. It would be the voice of an entire people who had decided they would rather stand tall and face the consequences than kneel and live in shame. The people had spoken, and their message was as clear as the evening call to prayer that echoed across their proud capital. The secure phone lines between Washington and various African capitals buzzed with frantic activity as word of the brewing crisis spread. Ambassador Patricia Williams, America's envoy to West Africa, found herself fielding angry calls from her counterparts across the continent. "This is not how diplomacy works," snapped Ghana's foreign minister during a heated conference call that stretched past midnight. The French ambassador to Burkina Faso contacted his superiors in Paris, warning that the situation could spiral into a broader anti-Western sentiment. International news networks began picking up the story with headlines questioning American diplomatic overreach in Africa. The comfortable assumptions of Western foreign policy were suddenly being challenged by a small landlocked nation that refused to play by the expected rules. In the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Secretary General Moussa Faki Mohammed convened an emergency session of the Peace and Security Council. Representatives from across the continent gathered virtually, their faces grave, as they discussed the implications of the American demand. "This is bigger than Burkina Faso," declared Kenya's representative, her voice cutting through the diplomatic pleasantries. The South African delegation reminded everyone of similar incidents during the apartheid era, when Western powers had expected African leaders to show deference. Nigeria's foreign minister spoke of sovereignty and mutual respect, while Egypt's representative warned of the dangerous precedent being set. The room buzzed with the energy of a continent that had grown tired of being treated as subordinate partners in global affairs. European capitals found themselves in an uncomfortable position, caught between their traditional ally and their growing economic interests in Africa. The German Chancellor's office issued a carefully worded statement calling for mutual respect between world leaders while avoiding taking sides. French President Macron, already dealing with anti-French sentiment across the Sahel, remained conspicuously silent on the matter. British diplomats privately expressed concern that the incident could damage Western influence across the continent. The European Union's foreign policy chief found herself drafting multiple versions of a response, each one revealing the impossible balance between American alliance and African partnerships. The traditional power dynamics that had governed international relations for decades were being openly questioned. Chinese and Russian diplomatic observers watched the unfolding crisis with keen interest, recognizing an opportunity to strengthen their own ties with African nations. Beijing's foreign ministry issued a statement supporting the sovereign equality of all nations, regardless of size or economic power. Moscow's representative to the AU offered quiet support for African leadership's right to dignity and respect. The ripple effects extended beyond Africa as developing nations across Asia and Latin America began questioning their own relationships with Western powers. By the end of the week, what had started as a simple diplomatic protocol had evolved into a global debate about respect, sovereignty, and the future of international relations. The storm that began in Ouagadougou was reshaping diplomatic conversations in capitals around the world. The International Summit Hall in Geneva fell silent as Ibrahim Traoré entered, his military bearing unmistakable, even in the tailored suit that replaced his usual uniform. Delegates from around the world turned to watch the young African leader, who had become the center of a global diplomatic storm. Trump sat at the head table, his expression expectant, as he prepared for what he assumed would be a moment of public submission. The cameras rolled as Ibrahim approached the designated spot, his steps measured and deliberate, carrying the weight of a continent's dignity. The tension in the room was palpable, with seasoned diplomats holding their breath for what would come next. Every eye in the hall was fixed on the man who had refused to bow to American pressure. Ibrahim stopped 3 feet from the American president, close enough to speak clearly, but far enough to maintain his dignity. "Mr. Trump," he began, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had led coups and faced down armed rebellions. "I come here not as your subordinate, but as the elected representative of the proud people of Burkina Faso." The room erupted in murmurs as delegates realized this would not be the ceremonial moment Trump had orchestrated. Ibrahim's next words cut through the diplomatic pretense like a blade through silk. "In my country, we salute our flag, our ancestors, and our people, not foreign politicians who mistake geography for hierarchy." The cameras captured every moment as Trump's face reamed, his carefully planned photo opportunity crumbling before the world's eyes. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the quiet clicking of camera shutters and the whispered translations of interpreters. Ibrahim stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, showing neither deference nor aggression, simply the quiet confidence of a man who knew his worth. Trump's security detail tensed, unsure how to respond to this unprecedented breach of expected protocol. Other African leaders in the room began to sit straighter, their own dignity suddenly feeling less compromised by their presence. The moment stretched like a taut wire, with the future of international relations hanging in the balance. When Trump finally spoke, his voice carried a tremor of barely controlled rage. "This is not how things are done." Ibrahim smiled slightly, the expression reaching his eyes, as he delivered his final words to the assembled world leaders. "Mr. President, perhaps it's time things were done differently." He turned and walked toward his seat with the same measured pace, leaving Trump standing alone at the podium. The hall erupted in a cacophony of voices as delegates processed what they had just witnessed. African representatives began applauding, their clapping growing louder as other developing nations joined in. The sound filled the hall like thunder, marking the moment when a small nation reminded the world that dignity cannot be demanded, only earned. As Ibrahim took a seat, he carried with him the hopes of every person who had ever been told to bow their head and accept their place in someone else's hierarchy. Within hours of the Geneva incident, social media exploded with videos of Ibrahim's defiant stand shared millions of times across every platform. The hashtag #StandTallAfrica began trending globally as people from Lagos to Nairobi to Accra celebrated the moment their dignity was restored. In Dakar, university students gathered in the streets, chanting Ibrahim's name and waving Burkina Faso flags alongside their own. The footage of Trump's humiliated expression became an instant meme, spreading faster than any diplomatic communique ever could. News anchors from Al Jazeera to BBC struggled to find precedent for such a public rejection of American authority. The moment had transcended politics, becoming a symbol of resistance that resonated far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. American cable news networks went into overdrive with pundits debating whether Ibrahim's actions represented a dangerous precedent or a justified assertion of sovereignty. Fox News commentators called it disrespectful and un-American. While CNN analysts praised the principled stand for dignity, the State Department issued a terse statement expressing disappointment with the breakdown in diplomatic protocol. But privately, officials worried about the broader implications. Congressional leaders found themselves fielding questions about American foreign policy that they had never had to answer before. The White House communications team worked frantically to control the narrative, but the damage was already done. For the first time in decades, America's automatic assumption of deference from smaller nations had been publicly challenged. European capitals watched the unfolding crisis with a mixture of concern and quiet admiration for Ibrahim's courage. The German chancellor privately admitted to her advisers that she had never seen an African leader speak so boldly to American power. French officials already dealing with anti-colonial sentiment across their former territories recognized that Ibrahim's stand could inspire similar acts of defiance. The European Union's foreign policy apparatus found itself recalibrating its approach to African partnerships. Suddenly aware that the old paternalistic model was becoming untenable, British diplomats began reaching out to their African counterparts, sensing an opportunity to position themselves as more respectful partners than their American allies. The comfortable assumptions of Western diplomacy were crumbling in real time. By the end of the week, the Geneva incident had sparked protests and celebrations across 3 continents. In Cairo, students marched with signs reading, "Died is not negotiable," while in Johannesburg, ANC veterans compared Ibrahim to Nelson Mandela. Latin American leaders began privately discussing their own experiences with American diplomatic pressure. Inspired by Ibrahim's example, the African Union announced an emergency summit to discuss mutual respect in international relations, with every head of state expected to attend. What had begun as a simple demand for a salute had evolved into a global conversation about power, respect, and the future of international diplomacy. The ripple effect of one man's refusal to bow was reshaping how the world thought about leadership and sovereignty. The emergency African Union summit in Addis Ababa drew every head of state on the continent, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and long-suppressed anger. President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa was the first to speak, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent fighting apartheid and its diplomatic legacy. "What happened in Geneva was not just about Burkina Faso," he declared, his words echoing through the packed assembly hall. Segal's Macky Sall nodded vigorously, remembering his own uncomfortable encounters with Western arrogance during state visits. Nigeria's president spoke of the oil deals that had required him to smile through condescending lectures about governance. The room buzzed with shared experiences of diplomatic humiliation that had been endured in silence for far too long. Kenya's William R. stood to address the assembly, his voice rising with passion, as he recounted similar incidents of Western disrespect. "How many times have we been lectured like school children, while our resources flow to their banks?" He asked, his question hanging in the air like a challenge. Ghana's Nana Akufo-Addo shared stories of aid conferences where African leaders were expected to sit quietly, while donors discussed their continent's future. The Democratic Republic of Congo's president spoke of mining contracts signed under implicit threats of diplomatic isolation. Each testimony added another layer to the collective understanding that Ibrahim's stand in Geneva had merely exposed a pattern of systematic disrespect. The anger in the room was palpable. Decades of accumulated frustration finally finding voice in the sacred hall of African unity. The younger generation of African leaders found themselves energized by Ibrahim's example, their voices joining the chorus of continental awakening. Chad's Mohamed Deby spoke of breaking the cycle of inherited submission that had defined African diplomacy since independence. Rwanda's Paul Kagame, despite his complicated relationship with the West, acknowledged the power of Ibrahim's gesture in reshaping global perceptions. The leaders of smaller nations, Togo, Benin, Guinea-Bissau, found their voices strengthened by solidarity with their Burkinabe brother. Even traditionally Western-aligned leaders, like Morocco's King Mohammed VI, sent messages of support recognizing that dignity transcended political differences. The summit hall resonated with a new energy, the sound of a continent finally speaking with one voice. By the summit's end, the Addis Ababa Declaration had been signed by all 54 member states, establishing new protocols for diplomatic engagement with foreign powers. The document demanded mutual respect, sovereign equality, and an end to paternalistic attitudes in international relations. Plans were announced for a Continental Dignity Fund supporting nations that faced economic pressure for maintaining their sovereignty. A new African diplomatic protocol was established, requiring unanimous consent before any head of state could be subjected to ceremonial humiliation. The declaration's final paragraph captured the moment's significance. The children of Africa will no longer bow to those who mistake power for wisdom, wealth for worth, or size for significance. As the leaders departed Addis Ababa, they carried with them not just a document, but a renewed sense of collective pride that would reshape African diplomacy for generations to come. 6 months after the Geneva incident, the landscape of international diplomacy had fundamentally shifted across the African continent. Ibrahim Traoré found himself at the center of a new movement that extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The young president's calendar was filled with invitations from universities, think tanks, and international forums seeking to understand the Ouagadougou model of dignified diplomacy. His speeches were studied in political science classrooms from Harvard to the University of Cape Town, analyzed as a masterclass in principled leadership. The man who had once been dismissed as another African strongman was now being hailed as a visionary who had redefined the relationship between power and respect. His influence extended far beyond the red clay walls of the Palace of Kozum, inspiring a generation of leaders who refused to accept diminished expectations. The economic consequences of the diplomatic revolution surprised even the most optimistic observers, as African nations began leveraging their newfound solidarity. The Continental Dignity Fund had grown to over $2 billion, supported by contributions from across the diaspora and emerging economies. Chinese and Russian investments in Africa increased dramatically as Western nations found themselves competing for partnerships rather than assuming automatic deference. The African Continental Free Trade Area gained momentum as nations recognized the power of economic independence in maintaining political sovereignty. Traditional aid relationships were being renegotiated with African leaders demanding partnership rather than charity. The old model of conditional assistance was giving way to a new paradigm of mutual benefit and respect. In universities across the continent, a new generation of students was being educated in the principles of dignified diplomacy that Ibrahim had demonstrated. The Ibrahim Traoré Institute for Sovereign Leadership opened its doors in Ouagadougou, welcoming young people from across Africa and the developing world. His speeches were translated into dozens of languages studied alongside the works of Mandela, Sankara, and Nkrumah. The curriculum emphasized that true leadership meant serving one's people with dignity, never compromising fundamental principles for temporary gain. Graduates of the program were already taking positions in foreign ministries, international organizations, and civil society groups across the continent. The intellectual foundation for a new era of African diplomacy was being laid by those who had witnessed the power of principled resistance. As the first anniversary of the Geneva incident approached, Ibrahim stood once again at the window of his office, watching the sunset over Ouagadougou. The city below him bustled with the energy of a nation that had rediscovered its pride. Its streets filled with young people who walked taller because their president had refused to bow. Letters arrived daily from around the world from other small nations inspired by Burkina Faso's example to stand firm against diplomatic bullying. The palace that had once seemed like a lonely outpost of resistance now felt like the headquarters of a global movement. Ibrahim smiled as he watched children playing in the courtyard below, knowing they would grow up in a world where dignity was not negotiable. The dawn he had helped to create was just beginning to illuminate the possibilities of a more respectful world. Ibrahim Traoré's refusal to salute proved that true leadership means standing tall for your people's dignity, no matter the cost. His courage sparked a continental awakening that continues reshaping global diplomacy today. What do you think about his bold stand? Subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below.